Great. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our Understanding Male Sexual Assault panel. Before we get started with our panelists today, we are going to watch a short video clip that I think really sets up kind of the tone for what we're going to be talking about today. I do want to say two of our panelists who work at Safe House are going to be late because they are out in the field dealing with clients, so they are coming. They're going to be a bit late today. But we will watch the video clip and then we will get into the question and answer. And I'm also going to let everyone know that you are welcome to ask questions after the panelists answer the prepared questions, okay? So without further ado, I'm going to share here the video clip.
I was sexually abused when I was about 8 by an older male cousin.
I've been sexually assaulted on 4 different occasions.
I was 6 years old the first time that I was molested. A neighbor named Hank took me into his house. And at first it was hugging, and then his hands traveled. And when I tried to push him away, he beat me. And then he raped me.
And I was haunted by the fact that this happened in a little girl's bedroom.
For a long time, I blamed myself. I was just angry because I'd go to school and nobody in school knew what was going on.
When I tried to tell my mom, she kicked me out of the house and laughed at me and told me I would never deserve anything better.
It became something that lasted until I was 17 years old.
I remember after it happened and after he left, sitting on a bed for a while, torn up and saying, I am never going to tell another living person about this. I went and got my friends, and I drove them home.
Thank you for reading that, Katrina.
Thanks.
Now, if you had the chance, how would you respond to this person's story?
I just feel like, or just like hug her. And just let her know it's not her fault.
You were a little girl. It's not your fault, honey.
You actually have the chance to meet that person because they're here today. This is James Metters. This is Mark Godoy Jr. This is Isaac Andrade. This is Walter Castaneda. This is Glenn Hall. He served in the Army for 30 years, retiring as Command Sergeant Major. And what you just read is his story.
My name is Glenn.
What you just read was his story.
Oh my God.
How are you doing? Good, how are you?
Doing good.
Thank you for reading that story.
I know the statistic is 1 in 6. I'll go into a room and I'll count 6 men. Like there's somebody else in here and they're probably dealing with it the same way I've dealt with it, which is not talking about it.
To share the same experience, I was young and I was in college. I was sexually abused. You know, we don't talk about these things, but it happens, you know.
I grew up in a Latino household where
I know what that's like.
my dad telling me, no llores, cabrón. No eres vieja, you're not a girl, don't cry. And on the other side, you're getting abused and you don't know what to say.
I joined the Army to die. I was abused from the time I was born till I was 17. Masculinity made me put away what I was feeling and not really deeply feel what had happened to me and recognize and acknowledge what happened to me.
Getting suspended in the 4th grade, getting in a fight, getting expelled from one high school, it's all part of the abuse. And it's all part of me, the child, my inner child, acting out and starving for attention.
One of the reasons I rose in the rank of the military, they like tough guys, but inside I was dying. It still makes me emotional. That what happened to me wasn't because of who I am. It was something that was done to me. It's not me.
I know a lot of males are too afraid to speak up, but I'm real open because I want to inspire the male survivors That's not just males with disabilities, but also males without disabilities.
Yeah.
Identify myself as a Black gay survivor. I had a lot of fear, and I just posted a link on Facebook saying, this is my story. If you want to read it, you can read it. And the response I got after that was nothing but kind.
Every time I share my story, especially as a man, I always hear back, hey, can I talk to you? Yeah, what's up? This happened to me too. This happened to me too. This happened to me too.
I'm not doing it just for myself. It's for many others whose voices not been heard before.
It's really hard not to cry. I'm really glad you've done the work, and I know that you changed somebody's life. So that's all I can say without crying.
You can survive it. You can get through it.
I think you're just so strong. Like, I don't know if you know it, but you're very strong.
Thank you.
It just makes you remember and realize that everybody has a story.
Okay. So hopefully that video clip gave you some insight, which we're going to be talking more today about male sexual victimization, and while predominantly women or girls experience sexual victimization, we are seeing males being victimized, and they gave you the statistic of 1 in 6. And so today we're going to be talking about male sexual victimization. Before we get started, I did want to point out that in case anyone is in need, we do have someone from the counseling center here, right back there. So thank you so much for coming. And if anyone needs them, please do feel free to reach out. And we're going to start here. We have all of these wonderful panelists, so I want to make sure that we introduce them. So I'm going to start at this end. This is Dr. Katie Radijak, who is an assistant professor in the Victim Studies Department. And then we have Linda Keyrose, who is an outreach education coordinator at Montgomery County Women's Center. And next to her we have Chastity Williams, who is an outreach education manager, also at Montgomery County Women's Center. And then we have Zacchaeus Castro, president of the student group, which is the Crime Victim Services Alliance. And next to him we have Dr. John Navarro, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Criminal Justice and Criminology. And then we have Tracy, and Tracy, I don't want to say your last name incorrectly. Tracy Zimzak, did I say that correct? Okay. From Safe House. And so we are going to talk to you today. Like I said, we're going to start with some prepared questions, and then I'm going to open it up for the folks at home to ask questions in the chat, and then also the people who are here, physically here, to ask some questions as well. So, first question that I'm going to open up to any of the panelists who would like to respond first. Why do you think there is such a stigma surrounding male sexual victimization? Okay, and we're sharing the microphones down there. Oh, you have to press the little red button at the bottom.
Yeah? Okay. Oh, there we go. That's much better. Okay, so I think one of the reasons when we talk about males' experiences of sexual violence, the reason that we don't talk about it and there's so much stigma has a lot to do with gender norms in society and what we culturally believe it means to be a man and to be masculine. And so when you ask people those questions, it brings up ideas about strength, right? Manliness, being able to provide, to take care of yourself. Now, if you ask the same people, what does it mean to be a victim or to be victimized, you're going to hear a lot more language that we associate with women. And so when someone who is a man does get victimized, it clashes with this idea of how they understand that they're supposed to behave as a man. And so it, first of all, becomes difficult for them to acknowledge that that's the experience that they've had, and it becomes even more difficult for them to explain it to other people. So when we talk about rape myths, right, we tend to think about the ones that affect women the most. But there are very specific rape myths that are specific to men who've experienced victimization. And because of this larger conversation around sexual violence, we tend to only talk about women, and it really leaves men out of that conversation. And we know that it does happen. So because of these cultural values around gender and masculinity kind of clashes with this larger conversation about sexual violence in society, and it leaves men out of the picture, and they don't know where to turn to, even if they're able to acknowledge that what happened to them was a form of violence.
Going based off of what you said, working with, when I used to be in advocacy and responding to hospitals and all that stuff, a majority of my clients were women. When I would see the male survivors, they would almost always come into the office. Never would I see them at police stations, never would I see them at the hospitals. It was almost always after the fact. A year later, 2 years later, somebody did this to me, this happened to me when I was younger. I never said anything. And exactly what you said, you know, society says, you know, what does it take to be a man, right? Man up, do not share your emotions, you should not show your feelings, do not cry, men don't cry, right? And that's what, sadly, a lot of parents do educate that too, and that's not okay, because regardless of your gender, regardless of what it is, sexual abuse and sexual assault does not discriminate. It happens to everybody, and when we talk about males, it's important to know that they are allowed to describe what they're feeling. They are allowed to say, hey, I am feeling this kind of way, I am going through something and I need the help, right? Without getting pushed back or saying, no, man up, you need to just suck it up and go with it, right? Tracy, did you want to say something?
There's one right in front of John.
I agree a lot with everything that has been said. As a sexual assault advocate for the last 8 years, even when I started off in my position, when we did the training, our manual only lists perpetrators as male and victim was always female. So one of the things that I've done in my position as sexual assault advocate has tried to educate people and change the languaging of our training manual, because when you're going into this field, if that's what you're being taught, that's what you're thinking and expecting when you go to the hospitals. But I have seen a few male survivors at the hospitals, and so it starts with just education. And so I do agree that when we talk about male sexual assault, it's very hard for people to comprehend that males can be survivors, just because in our society, movies and everything has always taught us that sexual assault is a male stranger and a woman in the bushes, and that's it. And so we have to expand that and look at and see that everyone is potentially a perpetrator, but everyone is also potentially a survivor. And so I think it starts with education and opening that up.
And just to expand a little bit on the thoughts about how we view male sexual assault, I think it's really important that we talk about things like Tracy brought up, you know, being inclusive in the language that we're using, but also, you know, outside of the professional setting in our homes. How do we talk to our children? How are we bringing up sexual abuse to our kiddos? When we talk to little boys, how are we educating those boys? How are we talking to them about their feelings and emotions? Are we creating an environment in a home setting where boys feel like it's okay to talk about their feelings and their emotions? So giving those kiddos the space to cry, right? To talk about how they're feeling, to open up about emotions, giving them the language and the vocabulary to do so. Rather than just saying, I'm angry, you know, well, what does that anger feel like? What are you actually feeling? Giving them the space to explore those feelings and those emotions gives them the ability to identify those things in the future. And so once they have that language and that ability instilled in, you know, in adolescence, then into adulthood, they're able to really verbalize some of the trauma that they may have experienced, or things that they've gone through in a real open and honest way.
All right. Any other thoughts on that question before I move on? Okay. So, thinking about that, what are some of the experiences that male survivors have had in regards to coming forward and then also within the system? Okay, Tracy.
I'm just going to go off of what the male survivors have talked about when they've come in to get services with me. The first thing that a lot of them start off with is they were just never believed when they came forward. And often, unfortunately, a lot of the abuse was suffered during childhood. And so they would go and maybe talk to a teacher, a friend, a trusted adult, and that person did not believe them. And people don't understand that when you're that first person of contact, if you shut down a survivor, you usually shut them down for good, because at that point, they're going to think that everybody does not believe them. So that was one of the first things, is they didn't feel believed. And often whenever they did talk about their sexual assault, instead of focusing on what they needed in that moment, people started to talk more about their sexuality, making them feel judged, making them question their own sexuality, especially if they were sexually abused by another male. And so instead of giving them what they needed in that moment, they were just forced to have to look into themselves and look at their own sexuality and explore that, instead of really being able to process the sexual assault itself. And unfortunately, for most of them, it takes them a few times to even come into a place like Safe House or any other nonprofit, because a lot of times they feel that these services are geared towards women. Most of our offices are staffed by women. And so without intentionally doing it, when males come in, most women are on guard and wondering, okay, why is this person asking about services? Are they a potential abuser looking for their spouse, their girlfriend, or something like that, instead of just treating them like anybody else coming in for services? Because once again, it goes back into those gender norms in society. So a lot of them feel judged just walking into facilities. A lot of the artwork that a lot of nonprofits have, once again, is always geared towards women survivor stories. So as a male, when you see that, you already feel out of place. You don't feel like you belong. You don't feel like these people are going to understand you. And so a lot of times it does turn off people from getting that service for a very long time. And so that's pretty much just from my experience, those three general things that have kept males from seeking out services and how they've been treated when they do seek services.
So to echo some of the points that were discussed there, and more from the perspective of from the scholarship together with popular culture, is that some of the experiences that males survivors have in regards of coming forward and within the system is that there's typically no crime script for male rape, and so because it is so uncommon, this kind of falls into this dilemma of the resources being ill-equipped, as you had mentioned. The language is not up to par to become inclusive for men, and so together with that, coupled with this narrative that you don't know where your experience kind of belongs, and so the research being also ill-equipped with these centers being usually populated by other women, and so it kind of reminds me, going back to this popular culture, of certain celebrities that came forward, and this kind of comes across this intersectional identity. And so coming forward with your sexual abuse experience, so Tim Roth is a celebrity. I don't know if you guys know him from Reservoir Dogs, but he actually came forward and said that he's been a victim of incest. And it's really interesting because I wondered what his experience was, and it's not really discussed. Another individual that came forward was Brendan Fraser. And here's a white male that comes forward, but more importantly, you have Terry Crews, who effectively is a black male, very masculine looking, and so he was persecuted. And it's almost like a very invalidating experience from just that persecution in itself. And also his sexuality was being questioned. And so I think that is going back to this crime script of just like your story seems unique, but in reality, it's probably not that unique. And so kind of looking at these other experiences that male survivors come along is that when you're even on campuses, you see 1 in 4. But you don't see 1 in 6. And so it's just kind of like, where do you belong in this, this whole scene of sexual abuse? And one of the things, and my final point, is there was an HBO documentary that came across in 2017, I want to say, and it was a young boy who was a victim of incest, and it's called Rewind. And I thought it was really fascinating because it seemed this story was hidden within the family, because who was abusing him was his uncle, and his uncle was abusing his own son, and the uncle was also being sexually abused by his brother. And then his father, the son's father, was also being abused by his other brother. And so it was just a very revealing documentary, and just kind of shedding light and illuminating about male sexual abuse.
I'm so glad that you brought pop culture into the conversation, because I think it's a really important place to kind of explore and talk about. When we talk about sexual assaults on the campus level, right? But looking even younger than the college age, when we look at how stories are reported about female perpetrators in the middle school, junior high, or high school setting, how are those cases reported, right? We hear things like, the young female teacher had an inappropriate relationship, right? However, if that were a male perpetrator, that would be reported in a much different way, correct? So even the way we talk about it, the way it's reported, it's just so different than how we handle female victims traditionally. Which that's a whole nother conversation, and how female victims have been handled historically. But for all intents and purposes, we're focusing on male survivorship, and so that's really the conversation to explore in how those cases are reported is just so different. We don't often dehumanize female perpetrators. They're kind of glorified in victimization, where it's a male survivor, is kind of glorified. When it's a quote like hot teacher, people will, I think Facebook is the best example, right? Because Facebook, you can really see the gamut of how people kind of think. They're really willing to put it out there. And so if you go into a comment section from a news article where a female teacher has perpetrated against male students, you'll see comments from people who say things like, oh, I wish I would have had a teacher like that when I was 14, or they're so lucky, I would give this kid a high five. And in reality, that child, right, because that's what they are, they're children, those children are now faced with lifelong trauma that they are having to cope with, and that they didn't ask for. And when you minimize it and you say things like, oh, I would give them a high five, you're really minimizing the victimization that person has then gone through, which brings up much more complex emotions and feelings on how to process that, because internally they may be feeling things like, I didn't want this, I didn't ask for this is making my relationships in the future really just disheveled and hard to navigate. But on the surface, people are telling me I should be happy, and I'm so glad that this happened to me. And so it brings up really complex emotions on how to cope and how to process the trauma that they've then experienced. So I think it's really important when we talk about male survivorship, it's really important that we talk about language and how important it is that we report on it in a real way. We call people what they are. She's a rapist, right? She's an abuser. Because if not, then you're bringing up much bigger issues.
Yeah, and I wanted to comment on how that ties back to what we talked about with the previous question. And one of the areas of masculinity that we didn't kind of really highlight is the idea that men want sex all the time. And that is a huge barrier for when men experience victimization and they come forward and they try to report, just like Chastity was sharing, right? People say, well, isn't that great? Didn't you want that sex, right? They treat it in society as this type of conquest, and that men are always aroused and this is always what they want. And that's a real barrier for when they do reach out for help, when that is the immediate response they get. And that goes back again to what Tracy was saying earlier, that this first response rate is so important. And when it's negative and reinforcing these stereotypes, they're not likely to seek out help again, right? And we know that that's true for men and women, but we have these unique barriers that we're not talking about when it comes to men. And we can even connect this kind of help seeking for men to kind of broader health help seeking. And that we see like when men have injuries, right, you rub some dirt in it, you'll be fine. Like don't cry about it. You don't seek out help when you're sick, right? And that kind of leaches into this area when we talk about victimization as well. And so it's adding in those additional barriers. And speaking from the same kind of lens that John was speaking from as an academic and what the research shows, is that a lot of times when men do reach out for help, sometimes they just want to tell their story because they've never gotten the chance to do it before. So it's not always that they want services or they want to report. Studies show that they often report less often than women do, specifically to the police and these formal services. But when they call like anonymous hotlines, they just want to tell their story and then they hang up and they're done because they don't want anyone to know who they are. They seek out kind of those anonymous resources just to be heard because they don't get that chance in society.
And a lot of it too is kind of what we've been saying is a lot to do with gender socialization. And the common phrase you hear all the time that boys will be boys. And it's kind of something you always have to kind of look at and think, wait a second, this is kind of a horrible misconception and a lot of pressure we're putting onto men to fulfill into this role that we've kind of molded for them. And there's a lot we can say in regards to that, but a lot of it is really easy when you just walking into a Walmart where you can see the sections are divided, blue boys for toys and pink toys for women. And when you're beginning to kind of look at the different ways you're being told how you're supposed to act because of your gender or because of how society thinks you should act, and that's when you begin to realize why it's so hard for men to reach out and look for these kinds of services, especially when you see it represented in the media all the time that what you are, you're the perpetrator, you're the abuser, and you're not allowed to be a victim.
So some of you have already sort of commented on this, but when male survivors are trying to seek services, what are some barriers that exist?
Once again, I'm getting a lot of this information just from the males that I've talked to, and they are afraid with the stigma. That's a big barrier that they have, is that shame, embarrassment, and guilt that they carry. The fear of retaliation, especially if it's within the family or somebody close to the family or somebody that they know, their fear of that retaliation, not just from the perpetrator, but also, like, for example, some of the things we're seeing is coaches and things like that in schools that are sexually assaulting people that they are coaching. And so not only do you have that fear of retaliation from the coach, we're starting to see that other players are retaliating against that individual, and they're being singled out and bullied and other things. So we see that as a form of a barrier. Lack of knowledge of where to go or even who to talk to. Because once again, it comes down to, you do research on most of these websites of sexual assault, and you tend to see just the statistics up there listed for women, and so it's kind of hard to find where you go as a male to report. And so that's a lack of a barrier. Like someone had mentioned before, just the time of victimization to the time of reporting, there's a gap between that, and that can also be a barrier of when they feel comfortable, when they're ready to come and talk, who do they go to? Will they be believed, especially if they're adults and this happened in childhood? Because I mean, we even see that with female survivors as well. So I know that lack of time between victimization and reporting is a barrier. And just fear of being judged again by society, fear of their masculinity being questioned, and things like that. So those are just some of the barriers that we do see that prevent males from coming forward and reporting, or even seeking out services if they choose not to report as well.
I think some other barriers that male survivors face are, from law enforcement perspective, the understanding of what sexual assault is and what sexual assault means against a male victim. Even the way the FBI defines rape, right? It wasn't changed until very recently to be more inclusive of male survivors. So just the understanding of what sexual assault means, what it is, what it looks like, what rape can be, people are really uncomfortable using the word rape, even more so when it comes to a male survivor. And so just having the basic understanding of what sexual assault can be defined as can be really complicated, especially if you have a survivor who is in a very rural area where law enforcement may not have the training or the appropriate information to handle those types of cases. They're much more easy to be dismissed and to be dismissive of those victims simply because they don't have that information. We're really fortunate here in Walker County and in Montgomery County where we have law enforcement officers who attend classes here at Sam Houston, and so that they have a very I think rich understanding of victimization and a very deep understanding of what a victim can look like and who a victim can be. So we're very fortunate in that capacity. However, that's not the norm. The norm is a lack of information, a lack of understanding, and a lack of knowledge of resources.
I think Tracy and Chastity covered probably every single barrier, but I think one of the biggest one that I can think of, and from clients that I have worked with in the past, is the lack of support. That is probably the biggest one that I have seen with clients coming in, especially male survivors who will come in after years later, they're now married, they have children, or whatever it is, and now they're being affected by it because maybe they were abused as a child, now they have children themselves, and now they think about, what if something like this was to happen to my child? What would I do if I didn't get supported when this happened to me, right? And so many times we'll get male clients, male survivors who will say, now I'm ready to get the help because now I know I have somebody that I need to take care of if something like this happens to them, right? But the lack of support is a big one, just in general, because, they have told their story once, it got shut down, they were not believed, and that avoided them from reporting or ever saying their story again. So that's another one.
I just kind of wanted to expand a little bit about the law enforcement response to male victimization. There are lots of barriers regarding that when you just dig into the specifics. And again, this has been said already, but I just kind of want to emphasize how, firstly, you have to be able to trust the law enforcement officers you call will be able to help you out. So then you have to kind of build up the courage to make that call. Then the first person you call is a dispatcher, and they have to believe that you as a man can be sexually victimized before they'll even dispatch an officer usually. And once that person believes that, you have to hope the law enforcement officer that responds and can help you in that emergency situation also believes that you've been a victim of sexual assault or abuse. And it just keeps going on. And that whole time you're just kind of hoping throughout the entire process that is this even worth it? Like, is this something that actually affects me? Is this something that I should even be reporting and looking forward to? Another thing is when we're looking at, I've heard stories of a man pacing in front of a center for sexual assault, trying to determine whether or not they should come in because they see everyone inside is a woman, and you're kind of nervous and you're like, hey, what am I going to do? Should I even be out here seeking help? Will they help me? Do they only accept women? And it's all of these thoughts and all these doubts crossing your minds, which is probably why we're not seeing a lot of these individuals reaching out immediately after the fact, and why we're waiting to find out 5-10 years down the line.
I just wanted to expand on a couple of things that our other panelists have shared. Going back to what Chastity said about kind of how we define rape, and she talked how, even the FBI used to have a definition that did not include men. So prior to either 2012 or 13, I can't remember which year, they finally updated their definition of rape and how the FBI collects data about that. Prior to that year, the definition was the carnal knowledge of a female, right, forcibly and against her will. So they already made sure that any data prior to that year did not include a single male victim, right? And this is at our highest level of law enforcement. So if you think about how it took that long for us to include that information, right, and this is one of those data sets that any, criminal justice student has learned in every single class they take, right? How many times have you learned about the UCR? And if you think about how many people who decided to develop resources used that data set to determine, you know, how much money we put towards this, how many victims there are, and that men have been excluded from that conversation from the get-go. And again, going back to this way we talk about language, almost every university I've worked at, when they have advocates on campus, they're housed in a women's center, right? And so if I was a male victim looking for resources, I'm not gonna wanna go into the women's center, right? That's gonna sound like something that doesn't include me, right? And there's a reason for why it's housed in those spaces, right? So it is important for us to have these conversations alongside how the resources and the conversation about sexual violence has emerged out of, the women's movement, but that doesn't mean we should be excluding men at the same time. A lot of times these services are tacked on kind of after the fact, and that means that they're not getting the same type of help that they deserve, right? And then one last thing that I wanted to bring up is this, same with defining rape, but this misalignment of calling rape sex. And this is something that is an additional barrier for men who may have been victimized by another man because they think of that as sex and not distinguishing it as violence. A lot of times it leads them to question their sexuality. And then they don't want to go forward because they're afraid people are going to accuse them of being gay, right? And that's a whole nother conversation we can have about homophobia and whatnot, but right, that's another barrier. And we need to make sure that we're distinguishing that, rape is rape, it's violence, it's not sex, that they're different things. And even if someone becomes physically aroused during an assault, right, that's a body response, and that doesn't mean that that survivor actually wanted that to happen, right? And that's something that I think is even more pronounced for men when we talk about their experiences of victimization.
So in addition to what the other panelists have said, so like for instance, Chastity had mentioned that some of the barriers would be that there's inadequate resources that are available for men, in addition to a lack of understanding. And I often think that some of the barriers that men face are equivalent to what women face. So for instance, there's an abuse of power. There's also not being heard or invalidated. And to elaborate, two of the thoughts that I had was, there's the barrier of a lack of diversity. And so I'm thinking about like each culture, racially or ethnically, are unique. And so I'm thinking about how when you're advertising male or sexual victimization in general, like around posters on campus, you just see a woman or just women in general. And sometimes if there is a man, this man is going to be non-heterosexual. So there is, as you had said, Katie, there's no space for the heterosexual voice. And this somewhat goes hand in hand with masculinity, but this expectation of self-sufficiency. And so even with other teammates I've discussed that who have shared their sexual adverse experiences with me, there's this sense that when they share it, they're often met with like, hey man, you got it. You got it. And this message is reverberated. And so I think that this expectation to just take care of it by yourself, and you hear that from your other colleagues, like your male peers, that's another barrier that you're met with. And so if that's someone that is another male, what is the expectation of you sharing that story with a woman, who are often the ones that are populating these resource centers?
All right, so thinking about these barriers that we just discussed, how can we help support male survivors?
I think the number one thing we can do is to just believe them, right? To believe, create spaces where male survivors feel comfortable enough to come to you. I think being a voice with, not for, right? But being a voice with male survivors is really important. And creating our homes, that's the first thing. Creating homes where we understand that survivor doesn't mean one thing. It's not one linear thing. Survivor can look much different in much different settings. Not shutting conversation down when people want to explore or talk about survivorship and what it means to be sexually assaulted, I think is really important. But also allowing men at the table when we have these conversations is really important. And so I want to thank both of you guys for being here, seriously, because it can get really uncomfortable for some men to have open conversations because of all of the barriers we've talked about today. A lot of times guys shy away from the conversation simply because of those barriers. But I think it's really important that we create an environment where it's inclusive. It's bringing multiple voices to the table to be heard, to ask questions in an open, honest, vulnerable way and not shut it down just because maybe it's not something we agree with. Allow those like really uncomfortable conversations and questions to be asked so that people have a better understanding.
I think one thing that brings me a little bit of hope is that, in the classroom, I am seeing so many more students that say, but what about male victimization? And so I think that we are starting to see, finally, right, more people that are wanting to ask that question. They're wanting to engage in that resource and create these services. And so I think that's one big thing we need to continue to do, is to push for that, like in your classroom space if you hear it not being talked about, right? In the workplace, if you work in law enforcement or, advocacy services, to raise that question. And the other thing, a lot of things that we talked about during this panel, we did go back to gender norms, right? And cultural values around gender. And so just as Chastity said, a lot of this starts in the home, right? It starts with children when they're young and how they understand gender, how they understand how it's okay to display emotion, right? I see this so much now with young parents that they tell their children that it's okay to say no if someone wants to hug you, right? So we are having these conversations at a much younger age than we used to about consent. And, making sure that we're not just having those conversations with our daughters, right? Making sure we're also having those conversations with our sons is really important. And we know from research about prevention that it's not effective to treat men as people who will become perpetrators in the future, right? So yes, it's important to talk to your children about consent when they engage in activities, right? So that they don't perpetrate violence. But we shouldn't only be having that kind of a conversation with our sons. We should also be having that conversation with our daughters, right? And all other genders on the spectrum, right? So we need to make sure that when we have those conversations with our children, that we're having the same types of conversations with all children, rather than keeping it that gender divide. And I see hope, right? I see a lot of people doing parenting very differently, so I have hope that it's going to continue to change, but really starting in the home is really important.
I think the best place to start off, well, for me, and how I recommend for individuals, is just volunteering. Because especially if you're male and you're volunteering in these places, you're showing that, hey, not only do they accept male volunteers, but chances are they'll also have survivors. And you can basically invite survivors in and say, hey, it's okay, men can be victimized too. So it's kind of showing that support out there. And a lot of it as well is, so I've been tabling outside in the LSU Mall pretty much 4 hours a week, every week since February. And I'm hoping that by doing that and by being able to stand out there, especially for this month, Sexual Assault Awareness Month, that we're able to look out to, I'm able to stand out there and say, hey, I'm advocating for sexual assault, not only for women, but also for men. And people are just walking by or looking at me and seeing the huge sign that we have out there, the activities we have out front. They're able to say, hey, look, this isn't just for women, and I can come out and help too. Another thing is implementing it into your daily life. So, we've talked a lot about gender socialization and the cultural norms that kind of surround us and make us fit into these certain roles. So in our daily lives, we should, or I try to do, is try to challenge them just every once in a while. Try to say, hey, doing something outside of what society tells you to do doesn't make you any less manly or less masculine. It doesn't make you weak in any way. It's okay to ask for help or to do things that may not be what others want you to do.
I think going based off on that as well, education is a big part of it too. You know, Chastity and I go into the middle schools, we go into the high schools, and it never fails. I can say you agree with this, Chas, but we'll talk about domestic violence, we'll talk about sexual abuse, healthy relationships, and it's like the girls are like, tell me more, and guys are like, oh, this ain't for us, right? And then we'll tell them stories on male survivors, right? And those are my favorite to tell to them because they'll say like, what? No? Like, that doesn't happen to us. We can't get sexually assaulted. And this is coming from high school students. So they'll completely, you know, shut us down. They won't listen to us. They won't engage in the conversation. But then we'll draw them in and say, okay, well, why don't you like to talk about your emotions, right? Why don't you like to talk about your feelings? What's up? Like, what is not allowing you to, right? And do you think it's okay then for a female to do this, right? So we'll start asking questions to bring up the conversation and to educate, because if you start real young, you know, you'll see a difference, right? Because if you don't educate and if you base these conversations on because you're a female, you know, protect women, and because you're a male, boys will be boys, right? Kind of how you said, but it's more like educate, right? Educate and teach them on this can happen to anybody, right? And then who do you go to when you need help, right? And the fact that there will be people that will shut you down or will not believe you, that does not mean for you to give up, right?
Most of my points have been covered. So there is an important thing I did want to add, though. When you are listening to their story, you know, do active listening and things. But one of the biggest things that I have to say to show support as you're listening is do not ask them for details about the assault unless they are willing to share that. Because too often when you speak to male survivors, they do talk about seeking out services, but having bad experiences with therapists, advocates, or friends, because people, since it's something not talked about, they want to ask intimate details about the assault. Like they find it fascinating. And so that's one of the things when you are listening to their story, never push for details beyond what they want to give you or what they feel comfortable giving you. Because a lot of times they feel like they're on display when people are asking for these most intimate details, and they feel they're just trying to get out the basic story, how they're feeling, get their feelings out. But a lot of times they're stopped when people are wanting these details. It makes them feel like they're in a petri dish. And so just listen to them. Let them share what they want to share and validate their feelings. Let them know that what they're feeling is a normal response to sexual assault. We don't all fit in a box. We all have different emotions and feelings when we are processing a sexual assault. We all have our own healing path. So let them know that what they're feeling is appropriate, what they're feeling is correct. There's no wrong way to feel when you are a survivor. So that's just something I wanted to add.
And the last question before I'm going to open it up to Q&A from the audience is, what can we do to help society better understand male victimization?
I think education is our biggest step forward. We need to educate our communities. We need to educate people, like we've been talking up here about social norms and things like that, going into high schools, but also having conversations in daily life, just opening the subject up. Sexual assault in general is a subject that nobody really wants to talk about. It's uncomfortable and it can be painful, but we need to have these conversations to get people thinking, to get people educated on the different issues, to help them understand that there are resources out there, and to also help them see how survivors look and that we're not all one way, that there are many different survivors, there are many different forms of sexual assault. So I think education and conversations is a good way to start.
I think another thing as well is kind of educating your friends. A lot of times when you're having these discussions with your friends and they can make poor or crude jokes or make poor or crude comments, that's kind of the easiest times where you can kind of be like, hang on, wait a second. And you don't have to call them out in a mean manner. I'm not saying, you know, if your friend says something because they're not educated on the subject, you know, drop them and never talk to them again. I'm just saying whenever that situation arises, make sure you're able to point something out and just say something akin to, hey, maybe you shouldn't say that, or hey, maybe we should talk about this at a later point, because this is something that not only for male victims but for female victims, it can hurt them and can further can further reinforce the idea that men can't be victimized or any sort of other sexual assault myths that we hear out there.
I think one of the biggest things too is being really intentional in how we consume media, right? Look at the movies we watch, the music we listen to, the TV shows that we binge, and look how they portray or talk about sexual assault, and especially with how they talk about male sexual assault and male survivorship. If we're intentional with how we consume that media, then we can kind of shift the narrative and how that media is produced. So if we create a demand for more inclusive, more understanding, more educated content, then that's what will be created. But we, as the consumer, have to demand it.
Yeah, and I want people to think about what kinds of platforms they have, right? So even within your friend groups, if you're in student organizations, in workplaces, if you have the chance to share information about male victimization, then do that, because we know that there are a lot of male victims out there, and they want to seek resources, right? They don't a lot of times have that knowledge, and maybe in your friend group there's someone that wants to talk about what they've experienced, but they're afraid, right, because of all these barriers we talked about, that everyone's going to shut them down. So if you have the opportunity on your Instagram or on your Twitter, right, to reshare some image with facts about male victimization, that might open the door a little bit for a friend that's looking for someone to talk to, right? And then someone might reshare that, right? So just think about all of the different platforms that we have today, because we have a lot of them, and think about how you can share that information that not only helps educate others, but can help label you as an ally, right? And then, think back to the other things we've said, right, that Tracy was just sharing about when someone does disclose, right, to listen to them, use active listening, don't pry, tell them that you believe them, right, you support them, and not kind of pushing what you think they should do next. We know from what we've talked about that there are so many barriers for seeking services for male survivors. So, not some things that we don't think about as like a negative reaction, but survivors do see as a negative reaction to disclosure, is when someone overly emotionally responds. They're like, I'm gonna hunt that person down. You have to report to the police, right? You need to seek therapy, right? You might think that you're doing the best thing in their interest, but a lot of times that can turn them off to talking to you more, because they feel like they're causing you pain, right, in that way. And sometimes those aren't the things that they need in that space. So making sure that you're not pushing your agenda of what you think they should do onto them, but just actively listening and supporting them.
And going based off of what you said, constantly just showing that support, because once that person has probably disclosed to you or told you that something like that has happened to them, they need the support, right? And that doesn't mean change your behavior with them. That doesn't mean don't include them in things because something happened, right? I know I had a survivor who said, my friends stopped. I told one of my friends it had happened at a party, and they stopped inviting me to parties because it had happened at a party. And it's like, no, continue the same way that you have acted with that person, because all they wanted you to be was an ear. All they wanted was to take this off their shoulders and for you to listen to them and for you to constantly support them. So just keep being that support system. Don't change your behavior. If you're always that friend that jokes around, keep being that friend that jokes around. I mean, they just need to know that you're there to support, right? And is exactly what you said, right? Just being there and not changing it. Okay.
So I think there's two things, or some things that we can do actionably, like as of tomorrow. We can create gender-specific products. So as I was saying earlier about the 1 in 6 signs, so instead of collapsing, 1 in 4 women and 1 in 6 men are sexually assaulted, rather just have the 1 in 4 sign for women and then the 1 in 6 sign for men. And then on these gender-specific signs, you can also include really masculine traditional images. And so you can have survivors coming forward like, hey, I'm an officer, or I'm a firefighter, or I'm a wrestler. And so to be one avenue to break down that stereotype or that barrier. And in addition to this, although it does sound unrealistic, but it is realistic, is having some sort of journalistic integrity. And so I say this is realistic because we're already doing this with mass murderers. And so here the conversation is like, let's not be so offender focused. And so just recently, right, you just had this event and they talked about the victims first. And then the offender followed suit. And so this has been in the works for like the past decade, right? This conversation about with mass murderers, let's not talk about the offender, but rather the victims. And so the same thing can be done here. And they're already doing this even across the academy in terms of journal integrity with research. And so I know there's always the, if it leads, it bleeds, but again, we're still doing this with mass murderers. And so this is something that we can start get the ball rolling for male sexual assaults.
All right, so we're going to take some questions. And folks who are here, if you have questions, Alyssa has kindly agreed to do the question and answer for us.
Okay, so this is our first question from our audience. Because abuse is happening at home for some of these kids, should parents also talk to children about listening to friends, being aware of signs in their friends, and when to alert an adult of concern?
Absolutely. Absolutely. The question is, the answer is absolutely. We should always be talking to our children about what to do if a friend or a family member comes to you and discloses that they've been assaulted. I think that can be one of the scariest situations for a child to have to experience. I know that myself and Linda have both experienced that as children with another child coming to us and disclosing an assault had happened. And just being really afraid and not knowing how to kind of process that and what to do with it or where to even go. So making sure that your children understand finding or having that trusted adult, how to respond. You know, if Sally says this to you or if Johnny says this to you, making sure that, you know, that's a really heavy thing to say or to take on. And so ask, you know, how are they doing? Are they okay? But come to mom, come to dad, find that trusted adult that you have that you can talk about this with. Because if not, a lot of times that information is then internalized, and if something escalates, blame and shame and all of these big, heavy emotions start coming into play for kids at a really young age. And it's a really heavy topic, but there's definitely ways that you can age appropriately handle it. And I think reaching out to organizations like Safe House or the Women's Center or the Counseling Center that have people who can help navigate those conversations. Asking for a workshop. We offer so many workshops for parents to talk to their children about sexual assault and things like that so that they have the tools in their tool belt to handle those big, heavy conversations.
I just want to add it on. I just want to add on real quick that it is Child Abuse Prevention Month along with Sexual Assault Awareness Month. So while we're both recognizing sexual assault, make sure, you know, since we're on this topic, to recognize that as well.
Yeah, and to move beyond, you know, just focusing on, you know, children being kind of the receivers of that kind of disclosure, I really appreciate this question because it does really center, just like Zacchaeus was saying, you know, we need look at this intersection between child abuse and sexual assault, right? And so think about all of these trusted adults that exist, like Chastity was talking about. So if you're an adult who's going on to become a teacher, right? Or are you going to volunteer in your community in some way? Making sure that those trusted adults are also educated from this standpoint, not just on female victimization, right? But male victimization as well, because we do know that with child abuse and child sexual abuse, a lot of those offenders, right, are people in the family. And so we need to make sure that that education is also coming from outside of the family and that support is in that location as well. So again, think of yourself, right, as an ally and a bystander. What locations do you occupy as a trusted adult, and how can you function in those spaces best for those who might need that support?
One thing I do, like being a mom and having 2 kids, one thing that I do always tell my kids is, and y'all can take this too, is, secrets, a lot of the times this is when, friends are like, keep this secret for me, don't tell anybody, you're my best friend and I don't want you to tell anybody. And let's say it's an adult doing something to a child and say, this is our little secret, right? Talking to the child and saying, no secret is safe, right? No secret should be kept from anybody if it makes you feel this kind of way, right? If you keeping this secret is making you feel yucky inside, it's making you feel like you're constantly thinking about it, nervous, don't do it, right? Do not keep these secrets. Let them know, if you tell me this, I'm not going to keep a secret because I don't do that, right? And like one thing I always teach my daughter, it's like, think about if they say a secret, say, well, will the secret be ever be able to be told, right? And it's like, if this secret is making you feel a certain way, then talk about it, right? So educating them on more to their level, because, you can't tell a toddler, this is what sexual assault is, right? And you don't deserve this, right? It's more like, how can we start, and what is consent, right? And it's okay for you to say no. And if you don't want to kiss uncle or aunt, then you don't have to, because that's what you say, right?
Well, I'm really glad that Katie brought up our space as trusted adults. It's so important to understand that as trusted adults in the state of Texas, we're all mandated reporters. It doesn't matter. If you're a citizen over the age of 18, you're a mandated reporter, right? And what does that look like? A lot of people are really afraid to reach out to Child Protective Services or to reach out to helplines when a child discloses an abuse or an assault to you. It can be really scary, but it doesn't have to be. So reaching out to local CACs or child advocacy centers or sexual assault and domestic violence advocacy centers, reaching out to them and asking, what does it look like? What does the process look like? I know that Linda and myself actually go into schools. We even go into daycare centers, and we do trainings on how to report. Because the process can be really scary or overwhelming for some people, and it's really not. It's a very simple process, but you know that just by making that report as a trusted adult, you can keep your position as that trusted adult. Because if a child comes to you with that information and then you do nothing with it, chances are that child wants you to do something with it, and so when you don't, you're now telling that child, I can't fully be trusted and I'm not going to protect you, right? And the process really is very simple, but the CACs, the advocacy centers, we can help you understand the process and make it less scary so that you know what to do.
As an advocate, I go into some very rural towns. I'm not sure if anyone in here is familiar with Groveton. Okay, we got one. We know how small it is. I've been in there the last 6 years, and one of the things I've done, not only as an advocate, seeing kids in the schools, I offer services at the elementary and middle school and high school. I have also started doing trainings during the summer for the teachers on how to report what sexual assault looks like and things like that. And I will say, my time there, we've actually started to see more students coming forward to their trusted teachers, and we've seen kids being removed from homes that they needed to be removed from, and also working with that school continuously, checking in with these kids and the teachers. And I've also had, like, in the past year, like 3 referrals from teachers who have had students reach out to them through a project or just talking to them that they have been sexually abused or physically abused. So once again, in this line of work, one of the things is building trust with the community. Groveton is, like I said, it's a very rural community. It's very small, but I've shown through the years with my partnership with the schools and attending local events that I can be a trusted person. And so they're using Safe House, they're using me, and we are helping the kids by building that trust, not only with teachers, but with the counselors and things like that. And also, I've had kids come to me and tell me, hey, I have a friend that needs to come and talk to you. They know that I talked to you about this and they're experiencing this. And so as a trusted adult, one of the things that I've learned is when I do talk to the kids, I'm up front with them. I let them know that this is a safe place to talk. However, I do have to report certain things, because that's one of the things when we are talking about sexual assault, child abuse, and things like that. The kids need to feel safe with you, and one of the ways they feel safe with you is if you're upfront with them and you're not lying to them. So as trusted adults, be upfront with your kids, but let them know that they're not going to be alone during that process, that you'll be there with them every step of the way. And I've seen kids coming forward and telling me, I'm ready to call CPS, can you be with me in this room, and things like that. So building that relationship is very important when it comes to assisting those with sexual assault and child abuse and domestic violence.
Okay, our next question is, do you believe that teaching about sexual assault during sex ed courses would ultimately be beneficial, or should we teach it separate from sex ed class?
Well, I think the biggest thing to know is that sexual assault has nothing to do with sex, right? It has everything to do with power and control. And so it's really its own separate thing. Sex is how it's acted out, but it's ultimately about how that person wants to feel powerful. And so it should be taught in every class and every setting, because you really can tie it back to pretty much every lesson plan. You can bring it up in math because you can look at statistics. You can bring it up in English because you can explore feelings and emotions, and there's space for essay opportunities. I mean, you can bring it up in social studies because you can look at how sexual assault has been occurring historically. I mean, it should be in every class and every setting because you can tie it back to any curriculum. But it's really, really important that people understand it has nothing to do with sex and everything to do with power and control. We know that the majority of sexual assaults are pre-planned, right? So that person is going to assault someone regardless of who that person is. It's about opportunity and about vulnerability. And I think that is the thing, is that a lot of times people assume that it's really sexual oriented because of how it's acted out, and they assume it's a spur of the moment, kind of in the moment thing where people are getting worked up and this is just how it comes out. But in reality, it's pre-planned. That person wants to feel powerful, so this is how they're going to exert their power. And that's why they look for lots of different variants when we talk about vulnerability, such as like being impaired or having special needs or disabilities and things like that. So they're seeking opportunity. So again, just to reinforce, it has nothing to do with sex, everything to do with power and control, and it can be taught in every single setting all the time.
So definitely, right? We said that a couple of times throughout this panel, really distinguishing between those two things. I think one thing that we can do in sex ed classes is be a lot more upfront to talk to people about having sexual agency and teaching people how to talk about the sex they want and the sex they don't want. So if you think about how sexual encounters are displayed in popular media, right? Do people talk during sex? It tends to be like this big music in the background, right? But no one's speaking, right? And we all know that's part of the problem. There's a really great book that came out recently that I'm going to blank on the title because I'm not good with titles. But they, asked college students to define what consent means, and they were really good at it. And then they asked them to talk about sexual experiences that they've had. So even though they can define what consent means to a T, in their sexual encounters, consent isn't being enacted, right? So just being able to know what it is doesn't really tell us how to do it, right? And so what we really need to see a lot more of in these sex ed courses is how do we become agents, right, in our sexual projects, right? How can we talk about sexual pleasure and the things we want and the things that we don't want? And to get comfortable saying that. I had a student once, and I said, you can ask for consent in ways that aren't awkward. And they're like, well, Dr. Radjak, how do you do that? And I was like, you're really going to make me do this right now, right? But I had the entire class say these words out loud, right? Because they were uncomfortable saying them. So how can we be open and have those kinds of conversations if we can't talk about it, right? So that's something we can try to incorporate into these sex ed classes in a way that might be different from focusing specifically on victimization, but helps us get out in front of victimization.
Our next question is, do you think entertainment media's presentation of male sexual victimization as humorous could be contributing to some of these issues, such as perceived legitimacy or law enforcement response?
I think we'll all answer yes. I think media plays a role in pretty much how we identify all types of victimizations, not just sexual victimization, but also I don't know, carjackings or muggings, right? Media plays a role in how we view sort of all things. And so it can definitely create barriers in how people see or view victimization, and also how they handle it as well.
Just briefly, absolutely. So one thing that kind of reminds me of is that I think it kind of goes into a broader sense with regard how sexual abuse is presented in the media. And so somewhat speculation, but also based in academic literature, is that, like, for instance, you will have certain stories that resonate with certain geographic areas. And so when I was doing some research in about Cleveland Plain Dealer newspapers and how they're able to imagine an offender, and then what is that response to that image. And so the image that they consistently were portraying, at least in these newspaper articles that were being published in the Cleveland Plain Dealer, was a serial rapist. And so it's minimizing the victims of other types of sexual assaults, like incest. But then in New Jersey, at least in New York Star Ledger, here is where the victim actually got the attention and the offender was not getting the attention. And then I say this because these are what the readers are reading. And so you kind of have like a pull between what the journalist is feeding the readers and then what is resonating with the readers and vice versa. And so just about how media is presenting is limiting the reader's attention as to what sexual abuse may look like. And none of these actually, I should mention, mentioned race, which I thought was really interesting. So they were like, it was almost like colorblind offenders. None of it mentioned gender. And so it was like gender blind as well. And so this kind of goes back to my point about journalistic integrity, and I'm not sure if I elaborated on that, but as you were mentioning, Chastity, I think when you label a teacher as somebody that was engaging in relations with a male individual, it's kind of like very interesting to me the terms that are used. Like, it's not rapist, it's not abuser, it's just like a softened term.
And we're talking a lot about mainstream media as well, but this kind of problem persists throughout all kinds of different cultures and within different subgroups. You have people from minority cultures who face a different kinds of barriers when facing these kind of issues, as well as other minority cultures or other minorities such as the LGBT community, or maybe it's because of the religious standards set you have previously. A lot of these barriers can persist, but they don't have to. It's kind of like we've been talking about throughout the entire session, is education.
Okay, the last question that I have is, what is the best way to approach our children about this topic and educate them? What age is appropriate? Victimization ranges in age, so when is the best time to talk about this to our children?
I'll just keep going first. I think that the best age is all ages. We should start having this conversation super young, like 1 and 2 year olds, but in very age appropriate and intentional ways. There are so many books out there that you can get to talk to kiddos, especially young kiddos, about healthy touch, good touch versus bad touch, your body and having bodily autonomy, and making sure that they understand that they say what happens to their bodies, and that when something bad happens, that they have that trusted adult that they can go to. And they, like Linda talked about earlier, secrets and not having secrets, especially secrets that can't ever be told, is super important. I just think having those age-appropriate conversations consistently really early on is the best way to handle it. I also think that when we talk about consent, consent is a really important part of the conversation, and consent does not have to be this one big scary conversation, right? Like, I actually did a class earlier this week, and I asked, it was with a group of professionals, and I asked the group, how many of you guys had conversations with your parents about consent? And of about 50 people, there were about 20 that said that they did. And I asked how many of you had a one-time big scary conversation with your parents about consent. And overwhelmingly, actually I only had 2 who said consent was an ongoing conversation in their household. And so the reality is consent is an ongoing conversation that we should be having and teaching in different age-appropriate ways, right? When we look at 1 and 2 year olds, we talk about sharing and how do we share our toys. And you don't have to give Bob your truck just because Bob is crying for your truck. You can continue playing with your truck if you had your truck first, right? You get to say how your truck is played with. And you don't have to give grandma and grandpa hugs and kisses, right? In the high school setting, food comes up a lot. High school students are very hungry. And, I had a student who she actually created a really great conversation about consent because she had a young man in the class who was reaching in her backpack every day and taking her chips out of her lunch kit. And I asked her, "Are you comfortable with that?" And she said, "No, I started bringing another bag of chips every day because he kept eating my chips." And so I'm like, okay, this is a really great opportunity to talk about consent. So it doesn't have to be a big scary conversation, a big one-time, all this pressure-filled conversation. It's ongoing. So talking to your kids early is really important, and get comfortable in the uncomfortable, because consent and sexual assault and sex are the least scary of the conversations you're probably going to have with your kids. So get really comfortable really quick. But again, there are so many books out there. Amazon has really great resources for age-appropriate books on your body and how your body is handled in secrets, in sexual abuse, and it kind of runs the gamut. They have so many resources with kiddo cartoon books and things like that, and they kind of grow with the children as they age. So books are really, really, really great. And finding movies, I think, that you can have like family movie night where kind of scary topics are brought up and you have family conversation following those movies is really great. Allow the opportunity for your kids to ask uncomfortable questions. Because if they ask you, you're going to give them a real answer. If they ask their friends at school, they're going to get not so great answers. So you can kind of control the narrative, and you can control their understanding and what their exposure is.
And one thing to go off of that is, making it not always such a scary conversation, right? So when we talk to college students, they don't want to say the word vagina. They don't want to say the word penis, right? That it's all of a sudden this like dirty word. And so making sure that your children know what to call their body parts. This is something that sometimes we hear from trusted adults like teachers, that someone talked about someone touching their cookie. And that's the language that family uses to talk about the vagina, right? And so making sure that those words aren't bad words in your household, that they're just words to describe what's on our body, can be really important. And just, I don't focus a lot on childhood victimization, child abuse, but it's important for us to talk about these things at those ages, right? And make sure that it's age appropriate and everything that Chastity was talking about. Because victimization when you're young increases victimization later on in life, right? And so we need to make sure we're having those conversations at those young ages so that we can stop victimization before it happens the first time, if possible. Because that first victimization increases your risk for future victimizations, and it also increases your risk for having unhealthy coping mechanisms, right? And it can increase your risk for engaging in behaviors that can lead you to end up incarcerated, right? So if we look at folks that are incarcerated, tons of them have a very long history of victimization that oftentimes goes back to their childhood. Okay, so that's why it's so important for us to start when they're young, because once it happens that first time, it's like this kind of ball that explodes in all of these directions and leads to future events that are going to affect them, right? And so it's kind of this cascading effect. So that's why it is important for us to have those conversations at young ages.
Yes, that's very true. When, for example, when I used to do advocacy and I would respond to hospitals or to Children's Safe Harbor, many times when we would get survivors, and they were all children, and the perpetrator was a child, my first question was, okay, what did they do to that child who is now a perpetrator, right? Because this child did not come up with it on their own. Something must have happened to them for them to now become an offender, and sadly, it was not addressed, or they probably did tell somebody and nobody sought the help, right? And sadly, you know, working through the years, I would sometimes even see children who would come in and they were sexually assaulted by a cousin or whatever the case was. Probably years down the road, I would see them again, but this time they were as an offender, right? And it was because, you know, they never got the help, they were not believed, or nothing really came out of it, right? So being able to have these conversations early on and saying, you know, it's never okay for somebody to do this, and teaching your kids your correct body parts, right? Because I know that I was not taught that when I was young. I teach that to my kids now, and my siblings look at me like I'm crazy, and they're like, what did she just say? And I'm like, the correct word, that's what she said, right? But being able to teach these words, because when they don't know the right vocabulary, that's when they get dismissed. That's when they're like, oh, it's something they must have heard. They don't know what they're saying, right? But if you hear a toddler saying, somebody touched my vagina, everybody's going to turn heads and say, what? Right. It's a complete different reaction rather than somebody touched my cookie, right? So vocabulary, education, and, you know, start by believing.
We actually have one more question. I'm so sorry. As a female victim advocate, what can we do to make male victims more comfortable talking to us?
I think for the most part, just starting with the believing. Let them know that you believe them, because that's what any survivor of any type of abuse wants, is to be believed. And then once again, like we had said before, creating these safe spaces for them to come and talk and just be open with no judgment, and letting them be themselves and sharing their story as much or as little as they would like to share. And also, one of the things that we are starting to see too is we are starting to see more male advocates stepping forward. So maybe that would be something too, is getting more advocates in the field that are male, that may share a similar experience, so that they may be more prone to open up. But in my experience, I work with a lot of teenage males and who have been sexually abused, and just being there and meeting them where they're at has helped, and building rapport with them and letting know I'm here. And also, you don't always have to start off with the sexual abuse. Start off by getting to know them, their likes, their dislikes, building that rapport so that they do see you as a trusted individual. And then when they do see you as someone they can trust, then they may start opening up slowly. And so it's just taking that time to build that relationship, at least in my experience with my male survivors that I do see.
So about 2 years ago now, I guess, I started working with our sexual assault response team at the hospital, which was something that I was super afraid of initially, but after kind of throwing myself into it, is something that I'm extremely passionate about. And what's interesting is a majority of the calls that I've gone on that have been sexual assault have been male survivors. And one thing that I think has been really impactful is allowing them to tell me what they need, or to kind of lead me in how to behave, right? So if I go into a hospital setting and that survivor is laughing or telling jokes, you know, joking around with them, acting normal, just giving them somebody who's like not treating them like a specimen, right? Just relating, finding those areas that you can relate, and really pouring into those areas, giving them the space to direct how they want the call to go. Not being overly questioning again, and digging in, but allowing them to know that, you know, I am a resource, I'm somebody who's here for you, and I want to talk to you about whatever it is you want to talk about, or not talk about. We can sit in silence if that's what you need right now, but just being what they need in that moment. Like Tracy said, meeting them where they're at in that moment. I think, again, having more male representatives in advocacy and in social work is really amazing, and we're seeing that a lot more now. But it's a predominantly female environment. It just is. And so I think, you know, having those skills, just like you would in a high school setting, having those like conversation starters that allow that person to know that you have like sort of a bond with them, or something that you can have conversation on, is really helpful and really important. And asking questions about them as a person, not about them in their victimization or in their trauma. What are you like? Where do you like to go? Who do you like to hang out with? Things like that.
All right, well, thank you to our wonderful panelists. And then everyone, thank you so much for coming to our panel today. The panelists are going to be up here. If you have any specific questions for folks who are here, please feel free to come up. And thank you so much. It was a real pleasure.